Tonight, we embark on a contemplative journey through some of history's most devastating conflicts, wars where soldiers face the lowest chances of returning home alive. Rather than dwelling on the horror, we'll quietly explore how ordinary people survived impossible odds and what these experiences teach us about human resilience and strength. This narrative is designed to help you fall asleep while learning something meaningful. The stories unfold slowly, with a gentle rhythm meant to calm your mind and guide you peacefully toward rest. You don't need to absorb every detail. Simply let the narrative carry you softly into dreams. Thank you for choosing depth and knowledge in these quiet moments before sleep. This is Educational Bedtime, where stories are long, voices stay soft, and history unfolds like pages turning in candlelight. Find your most comfortable position, let your shoulders drop, allow your breathing to slow, and feel your thoughts beginning to settle. We'll journey through 4 conflicts where survival seemed impossible, yet humans found ways to endure. Close your eyes and let these stories of courage guide you gently toward peaceful sleep. Chapter 1. The Frozen Hell, Napoleon's Russian Catastrophe, 1812. Let your mind drift back to the summer of 1812, when the greatest army Europe had ever assembled began its fateful march into Russia. You stand among the Grande Armée, 600,000 men from across Napoleon's empire who crossed the Niemen River with dreams of glory and expectations of swift victory. This polyglot force included French veterans, Polish lancers, Bavarian infantry, Italian engineers, Dutch artillery crews, and Spanish cavalry units, all united under French military discipline and Napoleon's reputation for invincibility. The sight of this army on the march was magnificent to behold. A river of steel and silk flowing across the European landscape with mathematical precision. The Imperial Guard marched with bearskin caps that added to their imposing height, their uniforms immaculate despite the dust of the road. The cavalry regiments created thunderous symphonies with their horses' hooves, while artillery trains stretched to the horizon, their bronze cannons gleaming in the summer sun like instruments of divine judgment. The logistics supporting this massive invasion represented organizational achievements that wouldn't be matched until the industrial warfare of the 20th century. Supply trains stretching for hundreds of miles carried food, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment necessary to sustain 600,000 men during a campaign expected to last only weeks. Behind the advancing army, mobile bakeries produced fresh bread for forward units, while portable forges kept weapons and equipment in fighting condition. Veterinary surgeons tended to thousands of horses, whose health determined the army's mobility, while quartermasters maintained detailed inventories of everything from musket flints to surgical instruments. The march into Russia began with optimism that reflected Napoleon's previous military successes. Yet the first signs of serious problems emerged long before the famous Russian winter began affecting military operations. The vast distances involved in Russian campaigning exceeded anything European armies had previously attempted, while the primitive transportation infrastructure couldn't support the movement of supplies necessary to sustain such large forces. The countryside through which the Grande Armée advanced showed signs of systematic destruction, as Russian forces implemented scorched earth policies designed to deny French armies the local resources they needed. Burned villages told stories of deliberate sacrifice. Peasant families had destroyed their own homes rather than allow French soldiers shelter. Wells that had provided water for centuries were filled with corpses and debris, turning life-giving springs into sources of disease and death. Even churches were stripped of their bells and burned to prevent their use as shelter. The Russian summer proved unexpectedly brutal. Temperatures soared beyond anything European soldiers had experienced, while dust clouds raised by hundreds of thousands of marching feet created respiratory problems that weakened men before they faced their first battle. Primitive roads disintegrated under the weight of artillery and supply wagons, creating quagmires that trapped vehicles and forced men to double their efforts to maintain the pace of advance. The food situation deteriorated gradually, then catastrophically, as supply lines stretched beyond their breaking point and local resources proved inadequate. French soldiers who had grown accustomed to living off the land during previous campaigns discovered that Russian scorched earth policies had eliminated the food sources that sustained earlier military operations. The bread ration dropped from adequate to minimal to non-existent, while meat became available only when horses died or were deliberately slaughtered. Medical challenges emerged that demonstrated the inability of early 19th century military medicine to cope with health problems created by campaigning on unprecedented scales. Dysentery spread through the ranks of men whose weakened condition made them vulnerable to digestive diseases, while typhus and other epidemic illnesses found ideal conditions for transmission among closely packed soldiers whose personal hygiene had deteriorated. Field hospitals became charnel houses where more men died than recovered, their condition worsened by primitive surgical techniques and complete absence of understanding about infection and disease transmission. The Battle of Borodino, when it finally came, provided the decisive engagement French forces had been seeking, but the results demonstrated the changed nature of warfare when armies of unprecedented size clashed, using weapons improved by advances in metallurgy and manufacturing. The casualties from this single day of fighting exceeded those from entire previous campaigns, while the tactical results proved inconclusive, despite the enormous cost in human life. The battlefield at Borodino became a landscape of horrors that wouldn't be equaled until the industrial slaughter of the Western Front a century later. Artillery bombardments continuing for hours created craters filled with dismembered bodies, while cavalry charges across terrain, carpeted with the dead and dying, produced casualties that exceeded the capacity of medical services to treat. The wounded lay among corpses for days, their cries for help gradually weakening until they joined the silence of those who had already paid the ultimate price. The occupation of Moscow represented a hollow victory that provided no strategic advantages while creating new problems Napoleon's military system couldn't solve. The city French forces entered had been abandoned by its population and systematically destroyed by Russian forces who denied their enemies the shelter, supplies, and symbolic victory that might have made the campaign worthwhile. The empty streets of Moscow created an atmosphere more terrifying than any battlefield. The silence where there should have been the bustle of urban life filled French soldiers with a dread that combat never inspired, while burned buildings stood like accusations against the futility of their sacrifice. The fires that consumed much of Moscow during the French occupation transformed victory into disaster before winter even began, destroying the shelter and supplies that French forces desperately needed. The decision to retreat from Moscow began the transformation of the world's most successful army into history's most devastating military disaster. The organizational systems that had sustained French armies during the advance collapsed under the combined pressure of winter weather, enemy harassment, and supply failures that created cascading problems affecting every aspect of military operations. The order to retreat spread through the army like wildfire, but instead of relief, it brought panic. Soldiers who had hoped for winter quarters in Moscow realized they must face the Russian winter in the open, while the prospect of marching hundreds of miles through hostile territory in deteriorating weather conditions created despair that undermined what little morale remained. Now you find yourself in the nightmare of the retreat itself. You're wearing whatever clothing you could scavenge from the dead, layer upon layer of frozen fabric that provides little protection against temperatures that drop to 30 degrees below zero. Your breath forms ice crystals that freeze to your beard and eyelashes, while your fingers lost all feeling weeks ago. The pain in your feet has evolved from sharp agony to a dull numbness that signals frostbite, destroying tissue that will never heal. Yet you continue walking because stopping means certain death, and some primitive survival instinct keeps your legs moving even when your mind has ceased to function coherently. The leather of your boots has cracked like dried parchment, allowing snow to seep through crevices that widen with each step. Your toes, once pink and warm, have turned a sickly white that signals the death of flesh, but you dare not remove your boots to examine the damage. The risk of never getting them back on your swollen feet is too great. Around you, other men stumble forward with similar determination, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed stare of those who have witnessed hell and found it wanting. The cold becomes a living enemy more deadly than any human foe. It attacks with weapons that cannot be parried or avoided, wind that cuts through clothing like sabers, temperatures that freeze breath in men's lungs, and ice that makes every step treacherous. The lucky ones die quickly when the cold stops their hearts, while others suffer the slow agony of frostbite that eats away at extremities while leaving them conscious to witness their own dissolution. As the retreat continues, you witness the complete breakdown of military discipline and social order that had once made French armies invincible. Soldiers abandon their weapons to reduce the weight they must carry, while officers discard the insignia that marked their rank and authority. The imperial eagles that had led French armies to victory across Europe are buried in Russian snow by men who understand that these symbols of glory have become liabilities. The food crisis transforms hunger from discomfort into a form of torture that affects every aspect of daily survival. Men learn to eat anything that might provide nutrition, leather from their equipment, glue from book bindings, organic matter that would have been considered inedible under normal circumstances. The competition for food creates social breakdown that destroys unit cohesion, while individual soldiers who find food must choose between sharing with comrades and hoarding resources that might mean survival. Cannibalism, that ultimate taboo, becomes whispered about in the darkest hours of the retreat, though few admit to crossing that final line. The knowledge that some have eaten human flesh spreads through the army like a moral plague, adding psychological horror to physical suffering and accelerating the breakdown of social bonds that had once made this force invincible. The river crossings that mark critical phases of the retreat create bottlenecks where thousands of men compete for access to bridges, representing the difference between continued movement and certain death. The crossing of the Berezina River becomes the most dramatic example, where French engineers work under enemy fire to construct bridges that can carry the remnants of the army across water that would kill anyone attempting to swim in sub-zero temperatures. The panic that develops among soldiers who fear being left behind creates stampedes that kill more men than enemy action, while the bridges themselves become so crowded they collapse under the weight of desperate men fighting for access to survival. The Berezina crossing becomes a microcosm of the entire retreat, as human nature reveals its capacity for both heroism and degradation under ultimate pressure. The survival rate for this campaign was the lowest in military history. Only 5% of those who entered Russia returned alive and whole. Yet within this catastrophe, we find stories of incredible human endurance, of men who discovered reserves of strength they never knew they possessed, and of small acts of kindness that preserved humanity even in the face of unimaginable suffering. The few thousand survivors who finally crossed back into friendly territory bore little resemblance to the confident soldiers who had marched into Russia with expectations of quick victory. Their appearance shocked even experienced military observers who had witnessed the aftermath of major battles, while their psychological condition required months or years of recovery before they could function effectively in civilian society. Chapter 2: The Last Stand at Thermopylae, 480 BCE. Allow your mind to drift across centuries now, from the frozen wastes of Russia to an ancient mountain pass, where 300 Spartan warriors chose certain death over surrender, creating one of history's most famous examples of tactical sacrifice in service of strategic victory. The year is 480 BCE, and you stand with King Leonidas at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the hot gates, facing a Persian army so vast that their arrows will darken the sun, knowing that your survival rate is exactly 0, but that your death might save Greek civilization from Persian conquest. The narrow pass between mountain and sea forces the massive Persian army to attack in formations no wider than the Greek phalanx can defend, while the terrain prevents the Persians from using their superior numbers effectively. Yet everyone present understands that this position, however strong, cannot be held indefinitely against an enemy that outnumbers the defenders by more than 1,000 to 1. This is not a battle fought for victory, but a delaying action designed to buy time for the Greek city-states to organize their defenses. The Spartan warriors who surround you represent the finest infantry soldiers in the ancient world, men who have trained for warfare from early childhood and who view death in battle as the highest honor their society can bestow. These are not farmers or craftsmen pressed into military service, but professional soldiers whose entire lives have been dedicated to mastering the skills necessary for combat. The Agoj system that created these warriors represents perhaps the most intensive military training program ever developed, a 20-year process that begins when Spartan boys are taken from their families at age 7 and subjected to hardships designed to eliminate the weak while forging the survivors into perfect soldiers. The training includes not only weapons instruction and physical conditioning, but also psychological preparation that teaches boys to value honor and duty above personal survival. The bronze armor that protects Spartan warriors represents the finest metalworking technology available in the ancient world, with each piece custom fitted to its owner and polished to a mirror finish that creates psychological as well as physical effects. The weight of this armor, nearly 70 pounds, requires extraordinary physical conditioning to wear effectively, but it provides protection that enables warriors to fight for hours without suffering disabling injuries. The Persian army that approaches the pass represents the largest military force ever assembled in the ancient world, a multicultural coalition that includes warriors from every corner of the known world, serving under the command of Xerxes, the King of Kings, who rules an empire stretching from India to Libya. These forces include elite Persian immortals, whose equipment rivals that of any contemporary army, Scythian archers, whose skills have been perfected on the steppes of Central Asia, and contingents from dozens of subject peoples whose diverse fighting styles provide tactical flexibility. The Persian immortals who spearhead attacks against Greek positions represent the elite infantry of the world's largest empire, warriors whose training and equipment approach Greek standards, while their numbers provide tactical advantages that the Greeks cannot match. These soldiers wear scale armor that provides protection comparable to Greek bronze while offering greater flexibility and lighter weight. While their weapons include both the traditional Persian spear and powerful composite bows that have conquered territories from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. The phalanx formation that the Greeks employ at Thermopylae represents centuries of tactical development, refined into the most effective infantry system available to ancient warfare. Each warrior's shield overlaps with those of his neighbors, creating a wall of bronze that enemy weapons cannot penetrate, while the long spears that project from this formation can kill attackers before they come close enough to use their own weapons. The precision required for effective phalanx fighting demands training and discipline that few armies can achieve, but when properly executed, the formation is nearly invincible against frontal assault. The aspis or hoplon shield that forms the foundation of phalanx tactics weighs nearly 15 pounds and measures 3 feet in diameter, creating protection that covers a warrior from neck to knee, while requiring significant strength and conditioning to handle effectively. The bronze facing reflects sunlight in ways that can blind enemies while creating visual effects that enhance the psychological impact of Greek formations. The combat that rages in the pass represents ancient warfare at its most brutal, where bronze weapons clash against bronze armor in personal encounters that determine life and death through individual skill and courage. The Greek warriors fight with the calm precision of men who have accepted death as inevitable while remaining determined to make their sacrifice as costly as possible for their enemies. Each fallen Spartan is replaced by another warrior who steps forward to fill the gap, maintaining formation integrity even as the number of defenders steadily diminishes. Day after day, waves of Persian attacks break against Greek shields like ocean waves against granite cliffs, achieving nothing except mounting casualty lists that begin to affect Persian morale. The narrow pass forces Persian attacks to come straight into the points of Greek spears, while the disciplined coordination of the phalanx prevents the kind of individual combat where Persian numbers might prove decisive. As the battle enters its final phase, betrayal by a local guide allows Persian forces to outflank the Greek position, turning a successful defensive action into a hopeless last stand. Ephialtes reveals to Persian commanders a mountain trail that has been used by local herders for generations, but whose military significance was unknown to Greek forces who had based their strategy on assumptions about impassable terrain. Leonidas dismisses most of his allied forces, allowing them to escape while keeping only the Spartans and a few allied contingents whose honor requires them to share the fate of men they have fought beside. The decision transforms a military operation into a deliberate sacrifice, as warriors who could escape choose death rather than abandon their comrades or compromise their honor. The final combat at Thermopylae transcends military tactics to become a demonstration of how human beings can face certain death with dignity and purpose that transforms individual mortality into collective immortality. The remaining Greeks fight with weapons broken by days of combat, using pieces of shattered spears and damaged swords to continue resistance, even when effective defense becomes impossible. Some fight with their bare hands when their weapons are lost, while others use rocks and debris when nothing else remains. The last moments of the battle see Greek warriors buried under Persian arrows and spears, but fighting until their final breath to maintain the reputation for invincibility that gives their sacrifice strategic meaning. The courage that enables men to face certain death for abstract principles like freedom and honor reveals capabilities that remain dormant during peacetime but emerge when circumstances require extraordinary responses to existential challenges. The aftermath of Thermopylae demonstrates how tactical defeat can achieve strategic victory when the sacrifice involved creates psychological and political effects that exceed the immediate military consequences. The news of Spartan sacrifice spreads throughout the Greek world, providing inspiration that mobilizes resistance against Persian conquest, while creating a symbol of defiance that transforms individual death into collective purpose. The political unity that emerges from shared outrage at Persian aggression enables Greek city-states to coordinate military efforts that had been impossible when they fought primarily against each other. The naval battle at Salamis that follows shortly after Thermopylae demonstrates how the time purchased through Spartan sacrifice enables Greek forces to prepare defensive strategies that exploit Persian vulnerabilities while maximizing Greek advantages. The Battle of Plataea that concludes the Persian invasion demonstrates the long-term strategic consequences of the delay achieved at Thermopylae. Greek forces that fight this decisive battle have been organized and equipped using time that Spartan sacrifice provided, while their tactical coordination reflects lessons learned through previous encounters with Persian forces. The cultural legacy of Thermopylae extends far beyond its immediate military consequences to influence how human societies understand the relationship between individual sacrifice and collective survival. The story of 300 warriors who chose death rather than surrender becomes a model for military heroism that influences warrior cultures throughout the ancient world, while the political lessons of effective resistance against overwhelming odds provide inspiration for later peoples who face seemingly impossible challenges. Tonight, as you drift toward peaceful sleep, remember the warriors who transformed certain death into eternal life through sacrifice that served purposes greater than individual survival. Their example demonstrates that human beings can transcend the limitations of mortality when they choose to serve principles and purposes that outlast individual existence. The narrow pass where they made their stand remains, but their courage echoes across centuries, reminding us that the greatest victories are sometimes achieved through accepting defeat in service of goals that transcend immediate circumstances. Chapter 3: The Somme Offensive, Industrial Slaughter, 1916. Let your consciousness drift forward now through the centuries to July 1st, 1916, where you find yourself crouched in a muddy trench on the Western Front, preparing for what military planners promise will be the decisive breakthrough that ends the Great War. You are one of 120,000 British soldiers about to go over the top in the largest offensive the British Army has ever attempted. The artillery bombardment that has preceded your attack has been going on for 7 days, firing 1.7 million shells at German positions that intelligence assures you have been obliterated. The survival statistics for this day will prove devastating: 60,000 British casualties in a single day, with 20,000 dead, making it the bloodiest day in British military history. Yet, within this mechanized carnage, we discover stories of extraordinary human endurance, of men who maintained their humanity and looked after their comrades, even when the very nature of warfare seemed designed to reduce human beings to statistics on casualty reports. The Western Front represents warfare transformed by industrial technology into something unprecedented in human history. The trenches that stretch from the English Channel to the Swiss border create a static battlefield where millions of men face each other across a no man's land that varies from a few hundred yards to a few miles, protected by barbed wire entanglements, machine gun nests, and artillery positions that can deliver devastating firepower with mathematical precision. The weapons that dominate this battlefield reflect the application of industrial manufacturing techniques to instruments of war. The machine guns that defend German positions can fire 600 rounds per minute with mechanical reliability, creating interlocking fields of fire that make infantry advances across open ground virtually impossible. The artillery pieces that support both sides can deliver shells with explosive power that exceeds anything seen in previous warfare, while their range and accuracy enable bombardments that can obliterate entire sections of trench systems. The logistics that support this industrial warfare require supply systems that dwarf anything seen in previous military history. Railways carry millions of tons of ammunition, food, equipment, and reinforcements to the front lines, while specialized units maintain communication networks, medical facilities, and engineering works that enable sustained combat operations involving millions of men. The complexity of coordinating these massive military machines requires staff work and planning that represents the most advanced organizational techniques available in the early 20th century. The trench systems where you live represent a subterranean world that has been carved from the earth by millions of men using hand tools and explosives. The frontline trenches where you spend your duty periods are typically 6 to 8 feet deep, protected by sandbags and wooden reinforcements that provide shelter from small arms fire while remaining vulnerable to direct hits from artillery shells. The communication trenches that connect frontline positions to rear areas zigzag to prevent enemy fire from sweeping the entire length, while command bunkers and aid stations are dug deeper to provide protection against all but the largest shells. The daily routine of trench warfare follows patterns that balance military necessity with human endurance. Stand to occurs at dawn and dusk when attacks are most likely, requiring all troops to man their positions with weapons ready, while officers inspect the line for signs of enemy activity. During daylight hours, movement above ground draws sniper fire, while nighttime activities include patrolling no man's land, repairing wire entanglements, and bringing forward supplies under cover of darkness. The living conditions in these trenches challenge human endurance in ways that previous warfare never required. Rats grow fat, feeding on corpses that cannot be recovered from no man's land, while lice infest clothing and bedding, despite efforts to maintain personal hygiene under field conditions. The mud that is created by constant rain, mixing with soil, churned by artillery bombardment, reaches depths that can swallow a man, while the smell of decay, cordite, and unwashed bodies creates an atmosphere that affects morale and physical health. The water that collects in trench bottoms becomes contaminated with human waste, corpses, and chemical residue from explosives, creating breeding grounds for disease that spreads rapidly among men whose immune systems have been weakened by stress, poor nutrition, and exposure. Trench foot develops when soldiers cannot remove their boots for days or weeks, while their feet remain constantly wet in contaminated water that causes tissue to rot while they remain conscious and aware of their deteriorating condition. The constant artillery bombardment that characterizes trench warfare creates psychological casualties that military medicine struggles to understand or treat. Shell shock, as it comes to be known, affects men differently. Some develop uncontrollable tremors, Others lose the ability to speak, while still others experience complete mental breakdown that requires evacuation from the front lines. The randomness of artillery death, where a shell can obliterate an entire squad while leaving neighboring positions untouched, creates anxiety that affects every soldier regardless of his previous experience or courage. The noise of modern warfare exceeds anything in previous human experience. Artillery bombardments create sound levels that cause permanent hearing damage, while the constant din of gunfire, explosions, and machinery creates an acoustic environment that makes normal communication impossible. Men learn to communicate through gestures and written messages, while the ringing in their ears becomes so constant that silence, when it occasionally occurs, seems more unnatural than the cacophony of battle. Sleep becomes nearly impossible in forward trenches, where the threat of sudden attack requires constant alertness, while the noise and vibration of nearby explosions prevent the deep rest that human beings require for psychological stability. Men learn to doze while standing upright, catching brief moments of unconsciousness between bombardments, while their dreams become filled with the sounds and images of warfare that continue to torment them even during brief periods of rest. The medical challenges created by industrial warfare exceed anything that military medicine has previously encountered. The wounds inflicted by high explosive shells create injuries that require surgical techniques that are still being developed, while the volume of casualties during major offensives overwhelms medical facilities that had seemed adequate during planning stages. The concept of triage emerges as medical personnel learn to prioritize treatment for those who might survive, while allowing the mortally wounded to die without medical intervention that could save others. Field hospitals become assembly lines for processing human carnage, where surgeons work around the clock performing amputations and emergency procedures that might save lives, but often leave survivors permanently disabled. The transportation systems that evacuate wounded from frontline aid stations to base hospitals require coordination between stretcher bearers, ambulance drivers, and medical personnel who risk their lives to provide care under combat conditions. Gas attacks introduce new categories of injury that require treatment approaches that don't yet exist. Chlorine gas burns lung tissue, creating slow deaths by suffocation, while mustard gas causes chemical burns that can blind soldiers while destroying their respiratory systems. The protective equipment available to combat troops provides limited protection against chemical weapons, while the decontamination procedures that might limit gas casualties remain experimental and often ineffective. The psychiatric casualties that result from prolonged exposure to industrial warfare create new categories of military medicine that require treatment approaches that don't yet exist. Men who break under the psychological pressure of constant artillery bombardment exhibit symptoms that range from temporary paralysis to complete mental breakdown, while the military justice system struggles to distinguish between cowardice and genuine medical conditions that prevent effective military service. The moment arrives when whistles blow and you climb out of your trench to advance across no man's land toward German positions that military intelligence has assured you were destroyed by the week-long artillery bombardment. The reality you encounter differs dramatically from the promises made by staff officers who planned this offensive from comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines. The German positions that were supposed to be obliterated proved to be largely intact, their deep bunkers having provided protection against all but direct hits from the heaviest shells. The concrete fortifications that German engineers have constructed during months of defensive preparation withstand artillery bombardment that would have destroyed earlier field fortifications, while the machine gun positions that emerge from these bunkers create interlocking fields of fire that turn no man's land into a killing ground. The barbed wire entanglements that were supposed to be cut by artillery fire remain largely undamaged, creating obstacles that channel advancing troops into killing zones where machine guns can achieve maximum effectiveness. The wire itself has been improved by industrial manufacturing techniques that create barriers more effective than anything used in previous warfare, while the patterns in which it is deployed reflect tactical understanding that maximizes its defensive value. As you advance across no man's land, carrying 60 pounds of equipment that includes ammunition, entrenching tools, first aid supplies, and rations for several days, you discover that the tactical situation bears no resemblance to the training exercises that prepared you for this assault. The ground that looked relatively flat from your trench proves to be torn by shell craters that create obstacles to coordinated advance, while the mud that has been created by artillery bombardment mixing with rain makes rapid movement impossible. The German machine gunners who emerge from their deep bunkers find themselves facing target-rich environments, where British infantry advance in formations that make concentrated fire devastatingly effective. The Maxim guns that defend German positions can fire continuously for hours, their water-cooled barrels preventing overheating, while belt-fed ammunition systems eliminate the reloading delays that might give attacking infantry opportunities to advance. The tactical doctrine that governs British attacks assumes that artillery bombardment will suppress or eliminate machine gun positions, allowing infantry to advance and occupy enemy trenches before defensive fire can become effective. The reality of German defensive engineering means that machine gun positions survive artillery bombardment and can deliver sustained fire that stops British advances before they reach the German wire. The casualties that result from this tactical miscalculation occur with shocking speed and devastating effect. Entire battalions that advance in formation find themselves cut down by machine gun fire before they can reach positions where they might take cover or return effective fire. The medical personnel who attempt to provide aid to wounded soldiers in no man's land become casualties themselves, while the stretcher bearers who risk their lives to evacuate the wounded find that the volume of casualties exceeds their capacity to provide assistance. The communication systems that should enable tactical adjustment to changing battlefield conditions break down under the impact of artillery bombardment and the chaos of combat. The telephone lines that connect frontline positions to headquarters are cut by shell fire, while the runners who carry messages between units become casualties before they can deliver information that might enable more effective tactics. The result is tactical confusion that prevents commanders from understanding the true situation, while contributing to continued casualties among troops who continue to attack positions that cannot be taken using available methods. The individual survival techniques that soldiers develop during this industrial carnage represent adaptations to conditions that exceed anything in previous military experience. The ability to recognize the sound signatures of different artillery shells enables experienced soldiers to seek appropriate cover before shells impact, while the knowledge of crater patterns helps them navigate no man's land during night patrols when visual navigation becomes impossible. The unit cohesion that develops among men who share the dangers and hardships of trench warfare creates bonds that often prove stronger than family relationships. The informal leadership provided by experienced, non-commissioned officers who understand both military requirements and human limitations becomes crucial for maintaining morale under conditions that would otherwise prove unbearable. The sharing of food, equipment, and shelter demonstrates human capacity for cooperation under extreme stress. The rotation systems that move units between frontline duty and rear areas provide temporary relief from combat stress, while enabling the training and re-equipment that maintain military effectiveness. The leave policies that allow soldiers to visit home create connections to peacetime life that help maintain psychological stability, while the medical facilities that treat minor wounds and illnesses prevent conditions that might otherwise become disabling. The small rituals and traditions that soldiers create help maintain human dignity under conditions that seem designed to reduce men to mere components of military machines. The sharing of letters from home, the improvised entertainment during quiet periods, and the informal ceremonies that honor fallen comrades demonstrate resilience that enables psychological survival, even when physical survival seems unlikely. The tactical stalemate that characterizes the Western Front creates a form of warfare that seems designed to continue indefinitely, consuming human and material resources without achieving decisive results that justify the enormous costs involved. The defensive advantages that modern weapons provide make breakthrough operations nearly impossible, while the industrial capacity of the combating nations enables prolonged warfare that can continue for years without either side achieving decisive advantage. The replacement systems that maintain unit strength require training programs that prepare civilians for warfare under conditions that exceed anything in previous military experience. The conscription systems that provide manpower for sustained operations affect entire societies, while the industrial mobilization that produces weapons and equipment transforms civilian economies into components of military machines. The propaganda campaigns that maintain civilian support for prolonged warfare require systematic deception about military conditions and casualties, while the censorship that prevents enemy access to strategic intelligence also prevents civilian populations from understanding the true cost and progress of military operations. The result is social commitment to warfare that continues long after the rational justifications for such sacrifice have disappeared. The casualty statistics that result from the Somme offensive demonstrate the changed nature of warfare when industrial technology is applied to military objectives. The 1.2 million total casualties from this single campaign exceed the populations of many European cities, while the tactical gains achieved measured in miles rather than the hundreds of miles that characterized previous successful offensives prove inadequate to justify such enormous human cost. The economic impact of sustaining such massive military operations affects every aspect of civilian life in the combating nations. The industrial production that supports prolonged warfare requires resources that would otherwise be used for civilian goods and services, while the agricultural labor that is conscripted for military service creates food shortages that affect entire populations. The social changes that result from prolonged warfare include fundamental modifications in gender roles, family structures, and economic relationships that continue to influence post-war society. The women who enter industrial production to replace men who have been conscripted for military service demonstrate capabilities that challenge traditional assumptions about gender limitations, while their economic independence creates social changes that survive the end of military operations. The psychological impact of industrial warfare extends beyond immediate participants to affect entire societies that must process casualty levels that exceed anything in previous human experience. The families who lose sons, fathers, and brothers must find ways to understand sacrifice that seems disproportionate to any achievable military objectives, while the communities that support military operations must maintain morale despite evidence that their sacrifice may not achieve the political goals that justified such enormous costs. The medical advances that result from treating unprecedented numbers of casualties contribute to healthcare improvements that benefit civilian populations long after the war ends. The surgical techniques that are developed for treating high explosive wounds improve trauma surgery for civilian accidents, while the prosthetic devices that enable amputees to function in civilian society represent advances in rehabilitation medicine. The understanding of psychological trauma that emerges from treating shell shock creates new approaches to mental health care that influence civilian psychiatry, while the organizational techniques that enable medical care under combat conditions contribute to emergency medicine that serves peacetime populations. The blood transfusion techniques that save lives on battlefields become standard medical procedures that reduce mortality from civilian injuries and surgical procedures. The pharmaceutical innovations that result from military medicine include advances in anesthesia, antiseptics, and pain management that improve civilian medical care, while the administrative systems that track medical records and coordinate treatment contribute to public health systems that serve entire populations. Chapter 4: The Global Furnace, World War II, 1939 to 1945. Let your breathing deepen now as we journey to the final and most comprehensive of these deadly conflicts, the Second World War, that transformed entire continents into battlefields and redefined the very concept of warfare itself. You find yourself not in a single trench or mountain pass, but part of a global conflict that touches every corner of human civilization, where survival rates vary dramatically based on where you serve, who you fight for, and whether you're a soldier or civilian caught in the path of total war. This conflict will claim between 70 and 85 million lives, making it the deadliest war in human history. The survival rates tell a complex story that varies enormously depending on circumstances. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers face a 40% chance of death, while Soviet forces suffer even higher casualty rates in some battles. Aircrew flying bombing missions over Germany have survival rates below 25% for completing a full tour of duty, while submarine crews face similar odds in the deadly games played beneath the world's oceans. The Eastern Front represents warfare at its most devastating, where Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union creates a conflict that combines the territorial scope of Napoleon's Russian campaign with weapons technology that has advanced exponentially since the Wehrmacht that crosses into Soviet territory in June 1941 consists of 3.8 million men supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces representing the most advanced military technology available anywhere in the world. The initial German advance creates destruction on a scale that dwarfs anything seen in previous warfare. Entire Soviet armies are encircled and destroyed in massive cauldron battles that capture hundreds of thousands of prisoners, while panzer spearheads advance hundreds of miles in weeks, crushing organized resistance and creating the impression of inevitable German victory. The Luftwaffe achieves air superiority that allows dive bombers to attack Soviet forces with impunity, while German artillery demonstrates precision that enables the destruction of specific targets rather than area bombardment. Yet within months, this apparently unstoppable force finds itself trapped in logistical problems that echo Napoleon's experience, while facing an enemy that has learned to use space, weather, and human sacrifice as weapons more deadly than technological innovation. The distances involved in Russian campaigning strain German supply systems beyond their breaking point, while the primitive transportation infrastructure cannot support the movement of fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment necessary to sustain mechanized operations across such vast territories. The Soviet response to German invasion reveals reserves of human endurance that exceed anything seen in previous warfare. Factory workers labor around the clock to produce weapons while under bombardment, while entire industrial facilities are dismantled and relocated thousands of miles eastward to prevent capture by German forces. The evacuation of industrial capacity represents organizational achievements that enable continued war production under circumstances that should have made manufacturing impossible. The urban combat that characterizes the Battle of Stalingrad represents a new form of warfare that combines technological sophistication with intimate brutality that approaches ancient warfare in its personal nature. Fighting occurs room by room through apartment buildings and factories, where modern weapons prove less effective than improvised explosives and close-quarters tactics that require individual courage rather than technological superiority. The factory district of Stalingrad becomes a three-dimensional battlefield where soldiers fight for control of individual floors, while enemy forces occupy positions directly above or below them. The rubble created by artillery bombardment provides defensive positions that favor defenders who know the terrain, while creating obstacles that channel attacking forces into killing zones where defenders can concentrate fire. The psychological stress of urban combat exceeds that experienced in previous warfare because danger can approach from any direction at any time. Snipers create killing zones that make movement impossible during daylight hours, while the acoustic properties of urban environments make it difficult to determine the direction from which shots are fired. The constant vigilance required for survival in such conditions exhausts mental resources within days, while the proximity of combat creates psychological intimacy between enemies that makes killing more personal and traumatic. The civilian population trapped in Stalingrad experiences warfare more directly than any previous non-combatant population in European history. Artillery bombardment destroys residential buildings while civilians remain inside, while the absence of functioning utilities creates survival challenges that equal those faced by combat troops. Food becomes available only through dangerous scavenging expeditions that expose civilians to sniper fire and artillery bombardment, while medical care becomes impossible when hospitals and medical personnel become military targets. The strategic bombing campaigns that target both military and civilian objectives represent attempts to achieve victory through economic pressure and psychological warfare rather than direct military confrontation. The Allied bombing of German cities creates destruction that exceeds anything seen in previous warfare, while failing to achieve the decisive results that bombing advocates had predicted. The air crew who conduct these missions face survival challenges that combine technological dangers with moral stresses that result from participating in destruction of civilian targets. The B-17 flying fortresses and other heavy bombers that conduct daylight raids over Germany must penetrate fighter defenses and anti-aircraft artillery that create casualty rates approaching those of infantry units, while night bombing operations face different but equally deadly hazards. The flak concentrations that defend German industrial targets create aerial environments where aircraft must fly through walls of exploding metal to reach their objectives. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns that form the backbone of German air defenses can create explosions that destroy aircraft at altitudes that had seemed safe from ground-based weapons, while the fragments from these explosions can damage aircraft systems in ways that make successful return to base unlikely. The fighter interceptors that attack Allied bomber formations use tactics specifically designed to maximize casualties among aircrew, rather than simply preventing bombing missions from reaching their targets. The head-on attacks that German fighters employ create closing speeds that exceed 500 miles per hour, while the concentrated firepower that these aircraft bring to bear can destroy bombers in seconds when properly aimed. The psychological impact of strategic bombing on German civilian populations demonstrates both the resilience and limitations of human endurance under sustained attack. The destruction of homes, workplaces, and cultural institutions creates trauma that affects entire communities, while the casualties from individual air raids can exceed those from entire previous military campaigns. The Pacific Theater creates survival challenges that differ fundamentally from those encountered in European warfare. The tropical environment introduces disease vectors and climate stresses that affect military operations, while Japanese military traditions that emphasize death before surrender create combat conditions that test Allied forces in unprecedented ways. The amphibious operations that characterize Pacific warfare expose attacking forces to defensive fire while they are most vulnerable. Landing craft approaching defended beaches must traverse coral reefs and tidal conditions that can ground vessels within range of enemy artillery, while the troops who reach shore must establish beachheads under fire from defenders who have prepared positions for months or years. The jungle environments where much Pacific combat occurs create tactical conditions that favor defenders who know the terrain, while challenging attackers who must adapt to unfamiliar conditions. The vegetation that provides concealment for defensive positions also creates obstacles to coordinated attacks, while the climate that supports rapid plant growth can conceal defensive installations within weeks of their construction. The tropical diseases that affect military operations in the Pacific create casualty rates that equal or exceed combat losses in many campaigns. Malaria, dengue fever, and other vector-borne illnesses disable troops faster than they can be replaced, while the medical knowledge necessary for treating tropical conditions remains inadequate throughout much of the war. The logistics of providing medical care across vast ocean distances create additional challenges that affect survival rates for both combat and disease casualties. The concentration camps and systematic genocide that accompany military operations represent the expansion of warfare beyond any previous conception of legitimate military targets. The survival rates in these facilities approach zero for most categories of prisoners, while the systematic nature of the killing process demonstrates the application of industrial organization to mass murder. The transportation systems that deliver victims to extermination facilities create survival challenges that begin long before arrival at camps. Prisoners crowded into cattle cars without adequate food, water, or sanitation face conditions designed to weaken resistance while maximizing the number of people who can be transported with minimum resources allocated to their welfare. The selection processes that determine which prisoners will be killed immediately and which will be used for forced labor before execution create psychological trauma that affects survivors long after their physical ordeal ends. The arbitrary nature of these selections, where survival depends on factors beyond individual control, creates anxiety that undermines human capacity to maintain hope or plan for survival. The work details that utilize prisoner labor under starvation conditions demonstrate systematic exploitation that treats human beings as expendable resources. The calorie restrictions that govern prisoner rations ensure that most inmates die from exhaustion and malnutrition within months, while the work requirements that prisoners must meet, regardless of their physical condition, accelerate the death process. The atomic bombs that end the Pacific War demonstrate humanity's achievement of destructive power that threatens not just military targets, but human civilization itself. The casualties from these weapons exceed anything in previous warfare, while their long-term effects create new categories of injury that medical science struggles to understand or treat. The Manhattan Project that develops atomic weapons represents scientific cooperation on unprecedented scales, while the secrecy that protects this research creates compartmentalization that prevents most participants from understanding the implications of their work. The industrial facilities that produce fissile materials require construction projects that employ hundreds of thousands of workers while maintaining security that prevents espionage or sabotage. The strategic decisions that govern the use of atomic weapons include calculations about casualties that would result from conventional invasion versus nuclear attack, while the political implications of demonstrating atomic capabilities influence international relations in ways that extend far beyond immediate military objectives. The target selection process includes factors such as military value, symbolic importance, and weather conditions that affect weapon effectiveness. The aftermath of atomic attacks creates medical challenges that exceed contemporary knowledge and capabilities. The radiation injuries that affect survivors create health problems that persist for decades, while the psychological trauma includes not only immediate shock, but long-term anxiety about radiation effects that cannot be fully predicted or treated. Conclusion: the wisdom of survival. Tonight, as you rest in peace and security that was purchased through the sacrifice of millions who face survival odds that should have been impossible to overcome, remember that human resilience has been tested by the worst circumstances that human beings could create and has emerged with knowledge necessary to prevent such catastrophes from recurring. The courage that enabled individuals to maintain their humanity under circumstances designed to destroy everything human and decent demonstrates reserves of strength that emerge only under ultimate pressure. The cooperation that enabled survival demonstrates human capacity for mutual support that transcends artificial divisions created by nationalism, racism, and ideological conflict. The technological knowledge developed for destruction has been redirected toward peaceful purposes that improve human welfare, while the organizational capabilities that enabled global military operations have been applied to international cooperation in addressing challenges that affect all human societies. The memory of those who died serves not only to honor their sacrifice, but to remind subsequent generations about the importance of vigilance against ideologies and political systems that make such conflicts possible. The international institutions created to prevent future world wars reflect understanding that human survival depends on cooperation rather than conflict, while nuclear weapons create deterrent effects that make traditional warfare too dangerous for rational political leaders to contemplate. The education systems that teach about these conflicts serve to transmit knowledge about the consequences of hatred, authoritarianism, and military aggression. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the generation that survived the deadliest conflicts in human history used their experience to build institutions and agreements that protect your rest. Their legacy reminds us that human ingenuity and cooperation can solve even the most complex problems when applied to purposes that serve collective welfare rather than individual advantage. Sweet dreams carry you into rest, protected by wisdom that emerges from surviving the worst that human beings can do to each other, while the courage that enabled survival under impossible conditions watches over peaceful sleep and reminds you that hope remains possible even when circumstances seem designed to destroy everything human and decent. The ghosts of all who perished in history's deadliest conflicts stand as witnesses to both human capacity for evil and human potential for good, their voices calling across the decades to remind us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against forces that would destroy it, and that memory of their sacrifice must inspire us to create a world worthy of the price they paid for our liberty to choose peace over war, cooperation over conflict, and hope over despair. In their memory, in honor of their sacrifice, and in hope for a future that justifies the cost of their courage, we preserve their legacy not as monuments to war's glory, but as warnings about war's horror and testimonies to the human spirit's capacity to endure and triumph over even the darkest circumstances we can create for ourselves. Rest now, carried by dreams of peace into sleep that honors those who ensured such peace remains possible, knowing that their watch continues in the institutions, values, and wisdom that their sacrifice made possible. May their courage light your dreams and their memory guard your rest as you sleep safely in the world their sacrifice helped create and their wisdom helps preserve.